Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on mergers and acquisitions. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. Firstly, the session will be recorded and this will be available on our website for you to return to. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please enter them to the right of the screen using the GoToWebinar control panel, and we will return to these at the end. We are joined by Peter Hawthorne, Global Mobility Transformation Consultant. Peter has extensive experience in HR. He previously worked at GSK for 17 years, leading the global mobility function through the merger of Glaxo Wellcome and SmithKline Beecham. A true thought leader, we are happy to have Peter present today.
Thank you, Lily. It's very kind. Hello and welcome to all of you on the webinar today. Let's just start by highlighting the key learnings that hopefully you will be able to take from our session today. Understand where the global mobility professional will get involved in an M&A, understand the types of issues to be considered in an M&A, recognize the opportunities, because they clearly are quite significant for the GM professionals, to improve their visibility to senior management across the company, and recognize the benefit of broad networking across the company. I think that's something that we really do need to emphasize as we look at this particular area. So let's look and move on now to mergers and acquisitions. Start with a statistic here. In 2017, $3.5 trillion worth of mergers and acquisitions were undertaken. When we look ahead to this year, 2018, and extrapolate forward from Q1 figures, it looks like there will be in excess of $4 trillion invested in mergers and acquisitions, driven in large by organizations looking to enhance their technologies, to boost their growth, and to gain access to new markets. So why do I start with that particular information? Well, I think what it shows is that the chances are that as a global mobility professional, you're going to be involved in at least one, if not many, mergers or acquisitions during the course of your career. And certainly in my own experience, I've been through three of these, and they are certainly provide real challenges and opportunities. But maybe what we first do when we move into this area is really take a quick look at the simple definitions of a merger and an acquisition. A merger basically is when two separate entities combine forces to create a new joint organization. An acquisition is basically the takeover of one entity by another. Now that's the simple explanation. The reality can very often be considerably more different. What you can sometimes find is what starts as a merger quickly becomes more like an acquisition. We've seen that in many instances, certainly in my own situation when I was working with Glaxo and we supposedly merged with Wellcome. It became very, very clear that it was a complete acquisition, that it was intellectual property that was wished to be gained, and that therefore set the tone in terms of how that merger came forward. It's not always, however, that the biggest company acquires a smaller company and then the bigger company is the one that has the influence. There have been many instances where smaller companies have actually bought larger companies, or smaller companies have been more agile in the organizational world, and therefore the people that run that organization end up running the larger organization. So one always has to be very careful in terms of not just looking at what the words say, but actually what the actions are that are behind that. And that's when you need to therefore look at a number of different levels to start to see what actually is happening. At the company level, very often a merger, you're looking in terms, what's the shape of the new company? Because the merger is bringing two entities together. So how are those being brought together? Are they being brought together on a global or multinational level? Are they geographically aligned, product aligned? What are the people's strengths that are being looked at in these particular areas? In an acquisition, well, what was the reason for the acquisition? Was it actually because you wish to gain intellectual property? Is it because you're looking to get some key services? Is it because you're just looking to expand your portfolio, get new products, access to new geographies, etc.? All these areas can have particularly material impacts in terms of the way that you need to think from a global mobility perspective. In an HR level, if it's a merger, again, very often, who's going to be the chief HR officer of the organization? Who do they appoint to their leadership teams? What sort of direction does that give you? Who are the most influential HR stakeholders? In an acquisition, sometimes you get exactly the same. Other times you just find that people are bolted in, or that you just get a broader range of maybe geographies that you're looking after, or divisions that have to be supported. At the GM level, that's the general manager level, again, you may find that in mergers that you've got appointment selection processes that basically everyone has to reapply for new roles. Or in acquisitions, again, you might just find that you're acquiring some new GMs, but again, maybe with different views of the world. Maybe you've got different products. Maybe you're looking at different talent profiles for who's required to support that particular part of this new acquired business. At a personal level, as a global mobility professional, you may well find yourself also in a merger, in a situation that you're up against your opposite number, or there may be other people brought into the discussion in terms of who should lead the particular global mobility area. And other times in acquisitions, well, it's about how you integrate that business into your own business. Is it a true integration, or is it just a slash and burn? Again, those are the sorts of things that one looks at. And budget and technology, which certainly from my experience in global mobility, budget and technology tend to be very poor, and certainly not something that one generally has the advantage of getting a large budget or a budget to look at new technologies. But very often, mergers actually provide a real opportunity to look at both budget and specifically technologies, because it's a real time when people are wanting to look, potentially looking to invest money, sometimes more available than it might be at any other time for the global mobility professional. And so something well worthwhile looking at in terms of mergers sometimes can release funds that maybe you would not have been able to access in the past. And certainly acquisitions may sometimes provide that if it's a large acquisition and there's a view that there's quite a bit of integration work to be undertaken. So, looking at that from the mergers and acquisitions, what then are the areas for consideration that we need to take account of? I think before I start going into this, I always like to just sort of take a quick review in terms of how are the majority of business decisions actually taken and what impacts those decisions. And I think that there's three factors that impact all business decisions, and they are power, influence, and self-interest. So let's start with the first one. First one is, who has the power to make a decision? Always hugely important in terms that you understand who is that individual or individuals. Secondly, who are the people who are able to influence a decision, either for the decision or against the decision? These are hugely important people also that you need to be aware of, that if you're wishing to drive a particular decision, who are the people that you need to help? And finally, how will that decision that you're trying to influence and trying to get made meet the self-interest of the decision makers and the influencers? This isn't from a selfish perspective. The self-interest could well be, how do I actually increase my sales? How do I make sure that this talent mobility program works more effectively? How do I meet the overall business workforce plan? But there's got to be an element of self-interest in there. Very few people actually make decisions and say, oh, well, yeah, I'll do that, even though I know that it's not going to be in my best interests. So you really need to think about that. And certainly when you're in a merger and acquisition situation, there are a huge number of business decisions. So it's hugely important to be able to understand who's got the power, who's got the influence, and how will you work with that decision to ensure that it meets the self-interest of those individuals. Maybe you think that's a bit shocking, but certainly in my experience, I've rarely come across a situation when those three factors did not play a huge part. So what are the areas that we consider within that the viewpoint? Well, first of all, you need to understand what the company business plan is. You know, whether it's a merger or acquisition, you're really just looking in terms of what is the business trying to achieve. Now, obviously, you're not going to have any real impact in terms of what that business plan is, but you do need to understand what it is, what the implications will be for the workforce plan. Because the HR workforce plan basically sets out how are we in HR going to support the business to meet its objectives. So you've got to understand the business objectives to then start to look and work with the HR workforce plan. Within that workforce plan, there are all sorts of different areas that we need to be aware of, because I think that it's so important that when you're looking at the workforce plan from a global mobility perspective, you've got an idea of what it is you would like to influence. And there are a number of areas that you would like to influence. You'd like to be able to understand the reward strategies. Global mobility has always been an area that's generally connected to compensation, not always reporting into it, but certainly with very strong links with compensation. And so you need to be looking at reward areas, and we'll talk about that in a minute or two. You need to be thinking about what's happening in leadership and development and performance management. You obviously need to be hugely interested in terms of what you're going to do within the global mobility area, because clearly that's your area of expertise, but you can't ignore some of the other areas depending on how the HR organization wishes to move forward. And then there's the company finance plan. And you sometimes think, well, why are we interested with company finance? Well, company finance very often, always set the rules with regards to corporate tax. So who's going to be the auditor? That always has a huge impact if you know who the auditor is, because you know that they're not going to be able to support you with regards to your tax planning and tax affairs. What's going to happen from a compliance perspective? What is the organization's view? So would impact maybe, for instance, thoughts about tax equalization. It might pick up areas like third-party currencies, offshore accounts, issues like that. You know, they can be very strong in terms of providing information that would help you understand the sorts of policies that you may wish to include within your overall global mobility program. And then group insurance, starting to look in terms of what might you be able to do from an insurance perspective, maybe with regards to pension arrangements, etc. So those are the sorts of areas that I think that it's worthwhile starting to have an area for consideration. So let's start to look a little bit more at the overall process that impacts the global mobility professional when we're looking at the merger, and we look at the appointment and selection process. So why do I have that first? Well, certainly if I look from the GlaxoSmithKline merger, that was communicated that we were going to merge in the February, and it finally got SEC and EU and other countries' approval in December of that year. What that meant was that the organization started quite quickly to start saying, right, we're a merger, everything's up in the air, we're basically going to appoint people in anticipation of the new organization being formed, so that on day one, when the organization is formed, we'll have the first, I think it was the first 3 levels in the organization down from the CEO, who would know that they were in designate positions. They could do some planning in advance so that on day one, they could hit the ground running. So that was quite interesting. Whilst it was February, it was announced the first HR process that was agreed was what was the appointment and selection process, and that kicked off in the April of that year. So what does a global mobility professional need to do at this particular point? Well, what became very clear to me was that there needed to be a very early connection with your global assignees. These individuals are probably feel more threatened than anyone else when you get into a merger or a major acquisition situation, because these people find themselves basically on secondment in another country, away from potentially the stakeholders and the networks that they had established before, and they are feeling extremely vulnerable. Certainly, I found it particularly useful to get in touch with all of my assignees. Now, I did that initially by email to talk to them, to try to give them some information very early on in terms of how will they be impacted, because clearly that's the first question that they're going to ask. What's going to happen within the new role? Will they still be an assignee or secondee? Will there be a selection process? If so, will it be based on their home or the host country? So the first thing one needs to do is to make sure that you get connected with those particular your global assignees, just to make sure that they have got a point contact. Don't assume that your HR business partners are actually picking up with these individuals. I found that I needed to go around and speak with many of the HR business partners in the organization to remind them that there were assignees out there, to work out what was the appointment and selection process that was going to take place, and what or who was going to pick up with the individual assignees in terms of ensuring that they had some contact and knew where they need to go and what process they were going to be engaged with. To the assignees, I said, you need to get as broad a business stakeholder network in operation as possible, but be aware that given that we were having a cascade of the appointment selection process, so we did each level first, you may well find that the person that you thought was your boss might not be your boss when you move into the new organization. So keep very close to what's happening. Make sure you're very nice to everybody that you come across, and network as extensively as you can do. Once you get to the position that the assignees are involved in that selection process, and we get to the position of the new appointees, there needs to be a discussion about what are the transition arrangements. You know, what's going to happen in my particular situation. With the situation that we'd got people that were in designate roles, so we indicated to them that nothing would change until the new organization was in play. However, when that was the case, then they would, if they were still an assignee, then we would deal with them appropriately. If they were being repatriated, we would repatriate them on their existing terms. But unfortunately, what you also found was that you would have redundancies. You know, there's never been a merger and acquisition that takes place that, frankly, there are not redundancies. Even in the best circumstance of an acquisition where you're acquiring something new, the back office areas are always ones that are targeted in terms of synergistic savings. So we never really get away from the position that there will be redundancies. But you need to be able to work through that. You know, how are you going to recognize the redundancy? Again, in my situation, I looked and said, right, well, if their assignment is no longer required, then we will remove or close out the assignment, bring the person back to the home country. If there's not a role for them in the home country, then we make them redundant on their home country terms. There would be occasionally a person who said, I wish to stay in the host country, and you would go, right, fine, you can stay in the host country, but we will make you redundant on the home country terms. Now, sometimes you would have to look at the contract, sometimes you'd have to look at the legislation in a particular country, and depending on that, then you would have to be flexible. But that was the basic principle on which I ran. And then you've got budget. Who's actually going to pay for some of these exceptional costs for the redundancies? We had a whole load of outstanding tax issues when we made some people redundant with regards to long-term incentives and them having worked in one country but they've been granted in another. So that took quite a bit of working through, and also working through with who was actually going to find the money to pay for that. The one thing about this appointment selection process, though, is it actually provides you as the global mobility professional to work with some senior business people, because you're inevitably dealing with some of the top people in your organization who are out on assignment. You also work with some of the most senior HR leaders in the organization. And what that does is it provides an early opportunity in the merger and acquisition for you to build confidence in your ability, both with them and with yourself. And that's critical as we move forward. And the next area that we move forward is to reward processes. Because within, again, the merger at GSK, was the first process that was agreed was the appointment selection process. The second process that was agreed were the reward processes. And this was fascinating because we were looking at a range of areas, but the organization had set out basically in its overall objectives that it was going to move from being a multinational organization to a global organization. That global organization was going to have certain global policies that it would apply on a consistent basis across the world. Now, that was a very important area to pick up on, because it gave me the opportunity to start thinking, right, so if we've got a view that we want to be more global, what would that mean for me within the global mobility space? Potentially, I could have a global policy, and when we come to the policy, I'll explain why that was important. But then within the reward processes, we looked at a number of areas. We looked at grading, salary, bonus and long-term incentives, pension. Those are the key areas that we were looking at in terms of the reward processes. And here, whilst I did not get hugely involved in any of those particular areas, what it did do was it gave me a good, again, sight of what should I be thinking about from a global mobility perspective. In grading, we moved to a global grade structure, which we had never had before in either of the two organizations. Now, a global grade structure actually finally gets you to a situation that when you're moving one person from one country to another, you can actually see if they're moving at the same grade. You can see if they're moving as a result of a promotion. You can see maybe if they're moving down one level to gain experience, something that we'd not been able to look at before. It also allowed us to look at other situations that potentially can be problematic from global mobility, is if we've got someone coming from a lower paid country to a higher paid country, and you're going to be working with other people in a project team, looking at working together, doing the same work, how do you actually get to a position that you actually try and ensure that you get some equivalency with regards to payments? When you've got a global grade structure, you're able to look at a global grade structure and say, well, if people are working at that particular grade, what might the host salary, base salary be for that individual? And then you can start to think about how might you position maybe your Indians or your Indonesians or your Africans who are working with some other groups, people from, say, Germany or America, and turn around and say, so where might we want to position people with regards to their overall assignment pay with regards to whilst they're working on that particular project? So that was very useful. We got onto salary, and it was determined that we would pay at a median salary by country. This was useful because it started to set an expectation that if we were paying salaries at a median level, then clearly we needed to be applying benefits and allowances at a median level within the Global Mobility Programme. However, because we were paying at median, we therefore wanted to have a higher proportion of reward at risk. So bonus and long-term incentives were very much tied to your performance in role. That gave an interesting opportunity then for us to look and say, well, performance is clearly a key aspect. Should we start thinking about looking at global mobility program? And one of the things that we did very quickly was we decided to take out the mobility premium and introduce an end of assignment bonus that would be applied not to people who were considered on the talent side, who were looking to get promotions, etc., as a result of going an assignment, but could we apply it to technical experts and people who are potentially in scarce skill areas, so that there would be an inducement to be successful in meeting their objectives for the assignment by the end of that assignment. So that was interesting in terms of, again, giving us some more ideas. Pension was another interesting area because, again, it reinforced this median position, and not only a median position, but it reinforced that we were going to look at defined contribution, or from a US perspective, a 401k approach to pensions rather than defined benefit. And this, again, raised some interesting issues that if we were going to look on that basis, could we apply some process like that for maybe a global pension plan for those assignees who basically were a long time out of their home country, had worked in various different countries, and basically were almost certainly going to be unable to pick up with the various pension requirements or retirement pensions that might be paid through the states that they had been working in. So very interesting area in terms of, again, providing some opportunities to look and say, right, what do we actually need to do? What tips are we getting from this that will inform our global mobility programs? So from reward processes, we then moved on to the talent and succession planning. And I think that when you're getting to the talent and succession planning, you really start to come to some of the, I suppose, the vision that you have in terms of what it is you're trying to build within your organization. And I think that the key thing that you're looking at within your organization is really comes back to the workforce plan. What is the plan? What are you looking to do in terms of driving key roles in your organization, filling those key roles, meeting and getting to the various geographies that you want to have, the gender mix that you want to get, the ethnicity profile that you want to get within your overall talent and succession planning processes. What's your definition of talent? Again, this is hugely important. Many organizations have got very different views of what talent is in their organizations. Sometimes it's their senior management, other times it's more junior management, sometimes it's graduates. In other organizations, it's key technical skills. It's getting people to go to certain areas that maybe they don't want to go to unless there's huge rewards because they're very unpleasant situations to live in. Maybe you want people to basically live in compounds and areas like that. So you've got to be really clear about what it is that is your talent in your organization, because very early on I'd taken a view after speaking with my HR colleagues that we really wanted to ensure that we were moving talent across the organization within global mobility, not really many other areas. And so we set ourselves a target of about 80% of our assignees would be classified as talent. Now, what was talent? When we initially started out, it was actually senior commercial and supply chain roles. It was technical experts in supply chains, R&D and IT. It was some finance roles, and it was also looking in terms of graduates. And so that's what we initially looked at in terms of saying what our talent was. Over time, that changed, but at the time of the merger, those were the particular things we were looking at, because we'd made some fairly major changes in terms of the management and leadership teams of the organization. So we wanted to make sure that that we're able to bed that down. And once you've done that, you then were looking in terms of, so who are the people that are going to be filling those roles next? And clearly we'd be looking at local talent, but also we were looking in terms of moving people across the world. We also wanted to get to a position that we were more diverse in terms of who we were looking at. We wanted to increase the number of women who were going on assignment. We also wanted to increase the number of countries who were actually providing support. And so we got to a situation very early on in terms of looking that, once we were in new organization, we got something like 54 home countries sending to 65 host countries. So we got pretty good in terms of a diversification. And certainly in terms of gender, we managed to get ourselves to about 25% of the GA population would be female. Clearly, that's moved on, I'm pleased to say, but that really came as a result of work being done in the talent and succession planning, how women were moved further within the talent structure, and so we're able to then leverage the global mobility programs. But diversity only works when you've got an inclusive environment in which people are going to work. And so often people look at diversity and forget about inclusion. And unfortunately, there are many instances where you can have a diverse organization, but actually, unless the people conform to one way of working, they can crash and burn. And that's a very unsuccessful way to run a diversity and inclusion program. So you need to start thinking very much about how do we make ourselves more inclusive, and that's when you need to be working with your leadership and development team. Now, again, leadership and development very often are absolutely overrun at a merger and acquisition in terms of trying to help people deal with the fact there is a merger and acquisition. They're looking at the new culture of the organization. They're looking at how the organizational design might work, etc. And within all of that noise, you do have to try and get the L&D professionals to start thinking a little bit about what are the unique advantages that you can give in terms of development experience to people when they're working overseas. I always used to say, if you look at the cost of a global assignee and you look at the cost of an MBA at Harvard, you actually pay more for a global assignee to go out on assignment than you would to a 3-year Harvard MBA. So if someone had a Harvard MBA, you would be all over them wanting to know how they were developing, what was happening, how can we use them next. If we're spending more on a global assignment, we need to be thinking about how are we going to make them more effective whilst they're on assignment, and how are we going to utilize that experience once they've come back or moved on from their current role to another role that maybe is back in their home country or maybe is off in another country. And you need to talk to them there about, cross-cultural experience. How do people actually work across borders? And I think that's a hugely important area that you need to be thinking about and discussing with leadership and development. You also need to think about who's going to lead many of these processes. Succession planning, pay recommendations, performance management are the three that sort of immediately come to mind. Many people have got the view that, well, if they're coming out of one country going to another, we'll use the home country, so it should be home country HR, home country business managers. They're the ones who should be looking after these areas. And there was a great debate at the HR leadership team around this that I was able to lead and facilitate. And actually, as time went on, it became clear that actually there was no home, host, home view. It was home, host, 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 maybe another home. And therefore, if you're working on that basis, who would be the best people to make the recommendations? And it was very clear when you start to do that, the best people to make the recommendations were the organization or the division that was currently looking after the individual whilst they were on assignment. So effectively, we moved to the situation that if an assignee had moved to another country or another division, that it would be that country, that divisional HR team that would be responsible to working with that the individual's business manager to talk about the succession plan, to talk about what pay recommendations would be made, to talk about what the performance objectives and the development objectives would be. And it was also the host HR's role in terms of looking at the next role for that global assignee, to debate and discuss with the global assignee, and it was their responsibility to then find another role for the global assignee. And that certainly proved to be a much better approach than always trying to get the home country to look after it, because there was no question that when people had left their home country, they did tend to be out of sight and out of mind. Whereas with your inner country, then you tend to be very much that area of interest. And so another very interesting area in terms of having an input, having an opportunity to shape some of the thinking that was going on in the very early days whilst you're going through that merger and acquisition. And then finally, we get on to the global mobility considerations. Now, this is not last but least, because effectively you're working in parallel. So whilst there's the appointment and selection, whilst there's a reward, there's talent and succession planning issues, all of those are basically going on in parallel with you looking at your global mobility considerations. And this certainly means that there's a lot of areas that you've got to keep your eye on. And it's not one thing that you can just do in isolation. I think that the one thing that you have to realize is the absolute necessity for really good networking. I looked at the HR business partners as being my eyes and ears into the organization. They were the people who were on the ground all the time, meeting with the senior business leaders, meeting with the assignees, understanding and plotting what the direction of that division, of that particular group was going to be. And they were the people who were best able to say what worked in the past, what didn't work in the past, what areas they thought it would be good that we could maybe address within the Global Mobility Programme. So I was fortunate to be able to work with a wide array of the HR business partners. I think I was working with, there were 3 divisions of the pharmaceutical commercial division. There were 3 divisions of the consumer business. There were 3 supply chains within manufacturing. There were 1 R&D group for the pharmaceutical area that had about 3 different subsets. There was 1 R&D group for vaccines. There was 1 supply chain for vaccines. And then there were the global functions. I basically had to ensure that I had input into every one of those particular areas, into their senior HR business partners in those areas, to understand from them what were their needs, what were their requirements, how could I work with a policy that would actually meet their requirements. And of course, that's just internal. External, it's also good to ensure that you've been speaking with maybe colleagues in other parts of other companies in global mobility, because again, you can always pick up some interesting aspects from what they're doing. Vendors are always very happy to talk to you, in particular where they know there's a big merger about to take place, because they're obviously, if they're currently incumbents, they want to stay incumbents. You're inundated with everyone else wanting to talk to you on the basis that you may wish to go out to the market. So again, I will be keen to share information with you. There's always consultants. I don't think I've ever worked in a large M&A without having to come across various groups of consultants. Very few of them, however, actually have much experience in global mobility, so they tend to talk in broader HR terms to you, but still you get some useful information. And academics, again, an area that very often people overlook, but academics very often can be at the leading edge of some thinking with regards to how you do your maybe organizational design, or how you look to develop global assignees, etc., in your businesses. And then they are very useful in terms of providing input to make sure that you've got this view of to what your best practice might be. And if you can establish that best practice, it's very good, because it then gives you that vision that you might of what you might want your policies to look like, and how you might need to look at some of the other areas that we've got within the thought bubble of how we deal with. So the vision that I came up with in the for GSK was really one from an international resourcing perspective, which was, how do we ensure that we move the right talent at the right time in a way that we can attract and retain them within the organization, and make the process work as effectively as we possibly can. Now, that sounds like a great sort of story to give, but that really was the focus of what it was we were looking to do. And so the policy review really started to work from that particular basis. It was a global policy. We had to apply it across the world. We had to ensure that the main items were non-negotiable. Grade and salary, those are the sorts of things that sat outside of the Global Mobility Programme, and so were things that that could be looked at. We wanted to standardize across the world. We wanted to try to reduce exceptions, and we did that by actually having a process that ended with the CEO. It was interesting, not many people actually wanted to make outlandish proposals to the CEO, so that kept the worst of the excesses out. Inevitably, there will always be some exceptions, but you could manage those yourself, working with your HR business partners to understand what were the particular nuances that you were dealing with. But you could at least ensure that, you could stop offshore payments. You could stop people being paid third country payments. You could stop people wanting to have huge houses in very expensive parts of the country, etc. By having that view that the CEO was going to sign them off. And the CEO was very much interested in these areas. It was interesting that when we did get the policy reviewed, it was reviewed by the CEO, and it was the third HR policy after award and appointment selection that he actually reviewed. So we had his endorsement to look at the costs. So policy, hugely important in terms of making sure that you have an idea of what it is that you want to then build. There will be downsides, though, and I think that's one of the things that you always need to recognize. And what you then need to be able to do is to work with that and then say, so how are we actually going to deal with these downsides? I mentioned that we were looking at median salaries. That impacted a number of people that were in Glaxo Wellcome who did not get a salary increase as a result of the move. Then they also were getting slightly reduced assignment benefits as well, which therefore meant it looked like some of those global Glaxo Wellcome assignees were going to be worse off, and some of them were literally key talent for the future. So we had to come up with a program. We introduced a transition allowance, where basically we worked out what would the program have paid out under Glaxo Wellcome, what was it paying out under GSK, what was the difference, and we made that a transition allowance that was frozen for the length and duration of the assignment. Good news was that no assignment would last longer than 3 years. If it did, it had to get agreed by the CEO, which again tended to keep that sort of program really well in place. I introduced that transition allowance because I came across a particular key talent that we had in Glaxo Wellcome that I thought would do well in GSK. Agreed it with my boss, who was the head of compensation, and we had not agreed it with the CEO, so we didn't tell the CEO, but we then paid that transition allowance to that individual plus a few other individuals. It turned out that I had to explain that package in person to that particular individual. The good news was that he became the CEO 8 years later, and that was quite useful, that I was able to do something that actually retained someone with the expertise who was able to move further within the organization. Cost savings, huge area. Everybody looks at cost savings. I have to say that the one area that I look at in cost savings is that I tend not to nickel and dime. I work on the basis of how much does an individual assignment cost. If I work in the basis that as a result of the model that I introduce, I've been able to reduce the number of assignees, therefore I've reduced the cost to the organization. As it was, I was able to, as a result of working with my HR colleagues, doing it very much from a talent perspective, but also recognizing there were scarce skills and other technical people to go, that I was able to reduce the overall cost of the program by £200 million, which I was very pleased about. Sorry, £200 million, that's rubbish. Sorry, £20 million. That was a result of just looking and saying, so what is the average 3-year cost of an assignment? And we came out that that was about £200,000. And then how many assignees were we looking at who potentially we could reduce? And that got us to that particular figure. So when you got that potential saving that you were giving to the organization, then it provided an opportunity to then say, so if you were getting that saving, what are the things that potentially we can do to start to make the program a little better? So we were able to introduce one or two things that, for instance, like partner support, employee assistance programs, intercultural development. Those were things that we threw into the program to make sure that we were actually meeting some areas. Technology, clearly, this is a place where sometimes money is available, and this is the time to be able to look and say, so what can we do with regards to getting better technology that would link with the broader HR systems, enhance data analytics, and also potentially could streamline the vendor supply chain and help also with cost and compliance when we were looking to maybe reduce big four costs. So technology is another area you can sometimes get money to invest in at a merger, as I mentioned before, and clearly can be very beneficial to the broader organization from a data analytics perspective. Vendor management, we wanted to move to a co-sourced model, and it was a good time to be able to start thinking, who did we want to work with? We wanted a vendor who would be flexible, who would look at who we were using and could adapt that within their own distribution processes, who was interested from an employee experience perspective. And that was hugely important in terms of that your vendors actually align with the way that you want to run your own particular program. Then you get to your own global mobility team. It turned out that actually what we really wanted was not experts in global mobility. What we actually wanted was we wanted people who were employee focused and really to be that they would walk in the shoes of the assignee, which was a particularly important activity from our perspective. We weren't in the basis we could teach them global mobility activities, but actually what we wanted the mindset was that they were basically looking to try to help to drive the employee experience and from an employee focused perspective. And that was hugely impressive from my perspective. I had a couple of locations, couple of hubs. One hub had no expertise with global mobility. The other basically had been a team that worked in global mobility before. I had more problems with the team who had always worked in global mobility than I had with the team that had no global mobility experience, because the mindset was much more about how do we work with our employees, how do we help to support them, how do we move forward and make this a good experience for them. And that was a really good wake-up call for me in terms of what I needed to have within that global mobility team. I'm conscious that I've talked on quite a bit. I mentioned the finance processes before, so I really won't talk in more detail about finance, other than you do need to make sure that you're aligned with those finance processes as well. But I do want to make sure that there's time for questions. So maybe if we open it up for any questions as a result of me sort of talking maybe slightly longer than I should have done.
Thank you, Peter. Some really great content. And I've actually got a question myself as a follow on. So, how did you find the
Right.
time to make all these connections?
Yes, it's certainly a very hectic time. It would be wrong to say otherwise. I think, as I mentioned before, that the key thing is to have a good network yourself. I did manage to make some very good connections with the HR business partners. I was based in the head office, so I had access to the Reward Centre of Excellence and to the Talent and Leadership Centre of Excellence. So that was good. And it's one of those things, you find the time when you recognize that you're able to make a difference, and I felt that I was able to make a difference, and people welcomed my input, which I think is always very encouraging.
Great, thank you. And then a couple more. Were you a global mobility specialist before the merger?
No, I was not. I'd worked in various parts of HR, and mainly from a change management perspective. You know, every role I'd been in was basically about trying to take the agenda forward, look at in terms of what was the art of the possible, and then see how we could get there. So I have to say that I'd been brought in to Glaxo Wellcome a couple of months before the merger was announced, to have a look at a particular project on international resourcing, which encompassed what the global mobility process or policies might be. And so I was brought in to do that. So I had no experience, I have to say, at all in global mobility prior to, until 2 months before the merger was announced. I suspect that it was known that there was a merger to be had, because I was effectively asked to wrap up the project within a month of the merger being announced, to say, right, well, that's what we're going to go forward with our proposals when we work with SmithKline Beecham to come up with an overall policy. So no, it was change management, and I think that there was an advantage in that, because I very quickly had to learn the details of global mobility, but it did allow me to sort of really take an objective look and say, so how do we move forward? And therefore spoke with many of the internal and external colleagues just to learn about what the art of the possible might be, and then come up with a view of how we then drove to get that change.
Wow, so a very steep learning curve for you. And then,
Yes, it was.
and then finally, did all the changes to the policy work correctly straight away?
If only. I think that what I will say is that the principles never changed, but there was a huge amount of rework and continuous improvement that had to be undertaken over the next, I would say, 2 or 3 years. You know, we have the situations that we were looking to introduce a global policy when there had never been one. We were looking to get people to follow the process, be consistent in terms of the way that it worked. And it was clear that we didn't have good processes in place. We had people who were resentful that they had were losing out on some of the activities that they'd done in the past. There was a feeling that sometimes there wasn't the flexibility that there was needed to be, and we were going to all sorts of countries that we'd not been to before. We were changing vendors, we were changing tax suppliers, we were changing payment methodologies, even just in terms of how the annual pay review was run. In the past, assignees tended not to get their bonus at the same time as everyone else, and we said, no, that's not going to be how it moves going forward. Just about everything that we introduced was different to how either one or both of the organizations or any of the geographies had done it in the past. So it took quite a phenomenal amount of time in terms of just moving forward. But as I say, whilst we had to rework and continuously improve, the basic principles never changed. And I think that's one of the things that, again, is worthwhile always thinking at is, try and be clear about what are the principles are that you want to move forward. Obviously, allow some flexibility. We're dealing with individuals with individual circumstances, so you can't get to a situation that just say no, no, no. There has to be flexibility there, but you can still have flexibility if you have the right principles.
Thank you. Well, Peter, that's all the questions. So I just want to say a huge thank you to you for giving us all a great webinar today. And this then concludes today's session. If there are any more questions that we didn't get a chance to answer, please feel free to reach out to us directly and we can point those in Peter's way and get you an answer. Thanks to everyone for joining, and we look forward to seeing you next time.